This is the April 7th Microsoft Graph Community Call. I'm Jeremy Thake. I am in the engineering team for Microsoft Graph and kind of head up the developer experience here on Graph, and I've been running this call for a while now and the podcast. We've got two really cool topics today. We tend to look at like what's interesting people externally via social, as well as like conversations we have with our customers. And Isaac Levin had been working on an open source project. And so I had a bunch of other people around the Presence API, and I was chatting to Isaac the other day and asked him, I was like, hey, do you want to come present? He said, sure, I can show you what we've built. And so I thought that'd be a good way just to explain what the Presence API does right now and what scenarios it can unlock for you if you're looking into this yourselves in your enterprise or maybe in the products you're building. And then Beth from our Microsoft Graph Toolkit team is going to talk about the 1.2 release with her creepy giraffe avatar on. Which, please don't smile, that makes it even worse, Beth. I feel like I'm going to be attacked by a giraffe. And so just one little call out, essentially. You can follow us all on Twitter down the bottom here. We've got the Twitter handles there if you'd like to try and keep up. Actually, all three of us are very active. We share all sorts of things around the graph on here. But one interesting thing, and I had this kept up, was if you just ignore the trends that Twitter is recommending to me, which is turning out Tuesday for some reason. World Health Day, there we go. That's thinking around the positive one. Is Leon Armstrong had actually mentioned that he's been waiting for this for a long time, which is the last login sign-in date for users. And it's been something I've been actively involved in with very large customers that we have on Microsoft 365. And the way that Leon actually found this out was if you go launch the user voice here, you'll see that this had an extremely high vote count compared to other Microsoft Graph feature requests that we had. And Dan Kershaw, who's been a PM on the Graph since its inception, essentially, actually went and changed the status of this on April 4th to it's being in beta. This status was marked as in progress, which essentially indicates that we're working on it and building it out. And so when you do sign into user voice, which I'm not in this browser here, but when you sign in here, if you do vote on anything and these statuses change, you will be notified via email as these things come through. So we categorize these things based on the different service workloads that are available inside of the graph. This maps basically to what we have in our documentation. And so if there are things that you're really, really desperately waiting for, we'd love to have your vote so we get your voice heard, and this really helps us when we go to the different service workloads that are on the graph to encourage them to go and build these things into the graph. But also in the comments at the bottom here, as well as just explaining or voting on these things, having a bit more information on why you need this actually helps us to understand the use case, so that when you ask for a feature, we totally grok exactly why you want it. Because sometimes we got asked for features on the graph, and then when you speak to the customer, you realize, they're not actually asking for this, they're asking for that. And we also want to make sure that we don't like set your expectations and bar really, really high, and then we ship the feature and it doesn't meet your requirement. And so by having the comments in these feature requests really, really helps us to understand why you would like to have that last sign-in date inside of the user object. So highly encourage you to go to microsoftgraph.uservoice.com and engage there if there are things you're waiting for. And obviously please engage with us there and on Twitter and social. A lot of the team are on there if you have those questions. And so I just wanted to call that out because I thought that was really cool that we've shipped yet another feature. Okay, so I can see Isaac's in the call. Isaac, are you ready if I introduce you?
Yeah, I can start now.
Excellent. So Isaac, it was cool to you reached out a while ago regarding the Presence API and the scenario you had, and the fact that you've open sourced it is great too. And so Thank you for joining today to share your experience with that. Introduce yourself, what you do at Microsoft, and then talk through the scenario. That'd be great.
Yeah, cool. Well, obviously, thanks, Jeremy, for inviting me to this. My name is Isaac Levin. I am a product marketing manager in Azure Marketing. So what I do is I kind of I'm responsible for the end-to-end content development for our first-party events in DevOps and tooling. So if you see a demo with Scott Hanselman or Scott Guthrie, myself or somebody on my team was heavily involved in that story. So to get to the content here, one of the things that I've always loved, I've been a work from home person for a long time. Actually, this role at Microsoft is my first work in office gig. Well, not right now, but first work in office gig in 5 years. So I've been working from home for a long time. And I used to take advantage of this application called Skew, I think is what it was called, where it was basically a tray app that connected between your Skype for Business instance on your machine and a Phillips Hue Light. It used COM APIs and a bunch of really other unsavory things. And I longed for the day when we were able to not be tethered to a machine to be able to do fun things like this. So I had been looking around on user voice in Teams. And one of the things that I looked for was, when are they going to have like the presence API available? Because I know that Teams makes a graph call every single time it gets presence. So I nicely nudged one of the people from Microsoft that responded in that chat train, and he said, look for it in beta around this time. And I think probably one of either the first or the second day it was launched is when I started fiddling around with it. And I had a proof of concept up pretty quickly, which has grown into something a bit bigger that's maybe a bit more usable for folks. And one of the things that I want to be able to do is make this available to everybody, regardless if you work at Microsoft or not, but also just give people an understanding of how Graph works. So with that, I can do a demo if that's what people have interest in.
That'd be great.
Yeah, cool. So let me share my screen out. Let me do that. Share my screen.
And for those that maybe aren't familiar with the light bulb scene, what's the deal there? You've used a particular one, but is the implementation tied to that brand of bulb or globe, depending on the world you are?
So right now it works for Philips Hue. I have a really rough working version that works with LifeX. And the goal is to be able to interact with as many of the Wi-Fi enabled bulbs as possible. Obviously, each implementation is a bit different. I realized that for LifeX, there wasn't a great great SDK for their API, so I actually wrote one. It's on GitHub now. I need to make some change. Yeah, I need to make some changes to it, but it worked for my particular prototype, so I just wanted to get up running there. But the application that you see here, this is it's a WPF application, so it runs in Windows only. It's called Presence Light. It's available on GitHub, and there's some information about setting it up on GitHub. But the long and short of it is that you have to, with Philips in particular, and sorry, the UI needs some work too. With Philips in particular, the bulbs aren't connected to the internet. The bulbs are connected to a bridge, which is connected to the internet. So in order for you to take full advantage of changing the colors of bulbs, you actually have to send the data through a bridge. So I have my internal IT of my bridge, and I can actually specify the light that I'm using. So that's the part that actually hooks you up to Philips Hue. For Graph itself, I'm using the Graph API and a bunch of other internal mechanisms like MSAL and things like that that people are probably aware of to log in the user and then pull the Presence API to give me what my presence is. So if I log in here, you can see that my light changed color really, really quickly, right? So if I change my teams to available, and this does, I'm not polling immediately, I'm polling every couple of seconds. So
where is your light, by the way? Because your camera is is that better? Okay. Keep that in view, and that way we can see it.
Yeah, that's cool.
And the code at the same time.
And the code at the same time?
Teams, we have to select your picture to see the light, and then we can't see the code that you're running.
Yeah.
Oh, I don't have Visual. I don't have Visual Studio.
It's not an Isaac thing.
Oh, okay. Well, I don't have Visual Studio up right now. This is actually running the actual installed version. So this application you can actually get. I can give you the link, Jeremy. So I have two versions. I have a version for Microsoft folks and a version for non-Microsoft folks. And the reason I have a Microsoft folks one is because in order to get the Presence API up and running, you have to create an Azure AD application. And let's just say for large IT organizations, it's not very easily done to set that up. Microsoft being one of them, but it's very, very easy once you actually know the process. So I'm just going to go ahead and change my status one more time. So I'm going to change it to busy. And what will happen is that this icon here will change color and the light changes red, right? So that's one of the cool things. And as well, since it is a tray app, I can actually close it here. And I don't know if you'll be able to see it, but let's see if I can zoom in here. So you see this little guy?
Yeah, that's
so
cool.
that's a tray app that actually indicates what my Teams presence is. So if I change this to available, this will change to green.
No, that's really
right?
cool.
So that's kind of the cool things that I've got going on with that. I also wanted to show you one of the things that I'm working on. The downside to using Presence Light in its current capacity is that it runs on Windows. And there's a lot of people that might want to take advantage of being able to broadcast your presence to a bulb in your house without Windows machines. Maybe they run Mac, maybe they have Linux. So I'm actually in the process of writing a .NET Core Blazor application that does this for you. So in here, I'm running in WSL, which is Windows Subsystem for Linux right now, and I can actually prove that. If I open up Google Chrome here, this is going to pop open a window. This is what is my user agent, and as you can see, it says that I'm running Linux, right? So one of the things that I can do here is I can actually run my application inside of Windows Subsystem for Linux. It's actually going to pop a web window that's going to allow me to log in, and then it's going to do the exact same thing that we did in Presence Light, except it runs cross-platform. So let's start this guy up. And this is still like a working prototype, so it's not fully baked yet. But as you can see here, it's telling me what my presence is here. It's broadcasting this, and it can change it here. So, and this will update too. But the beauty of this is that once I close this web browser, everything still works. So if I change this back to available, this light is going to change back to green. So I don't even need the browser up, and all I need is this application that's running in process. So it's one of those things where trying to get the experience of Presence Light or just be able to broadcast your presence using the Presence API to multiple platforms if possible. So that's kind
really
of
cool.
what I've been working on lately. So the goal is to get this, is to kind of clean up some of the hiccups with the WPF side, make it like really fully baked so folks that aren't technical can take advantage of it. And then for folks that are a bit more technical, or if they're on Mac or Linux, they can take advantage of the other one. And I'll be sure to make sure, Jeremy, that you get the links to a lot of the downloads of stuff. And yeah, so this has been really, really fun. And I really appreciate, you and everybody on the Graphs team patience with me, because I've been asking a lot of questions and probably being a bit frustrating. But I think one of the things that I've been taking full advantage of since I've worked at Microsoft is if I can find somebody's information, like in the GAL or the global address list, and figure out what they do, and if they can help me, I'm going to take advantage of that. So
Yeah,
that's my demo. And like Jeremy showed, my Twitter handle is Isaac R11. If you have any questions about Presence Light or just what was done to set up the Presence API, I know in these times, everybody needs to take full advantage of everything we can when we're working from home. So I hope people set some value there.
So I'd love to see some code. I know you don't have Visual Studio open, but I'm just sharing the GitHub repo in the chat. Is there any chance you could show us where the key call is to the graph, and then we can just talk a little bit more about the API itself as well?
Sure.
So one thing while Isaac's doing that, the Presence API is still in beta, and so for fun things like that, this is fine. But rolling this out to a corporate environment and doing this as a standard within your office, obviously being in beta has some risk associated with it. Things will may change. The whole idea of our beta period is that if the API gets feedback and we need to change the signature of the API or how the behavior of the API, that we will do that. We do tend to now blog if we're going to make changes that will impact you even if you are using beta, but it's just worth bearing in mind our supportability state with a beta API.
Yeah, that's a good call out, right? Like beta software is always subject to change. So one of the things that's really great about the Graph API as well, and the Presence API, obviously, well, just Graph in general, is that the SDK is really, really well baked. So, if
Daryl will
if
be
they're
happy that you said
if
that,
they're
Isaac. We didn't have to even give you any money for that.
well, you don't know what's going on the side, right? So, but one of the things that's great about the Graph SDK is that it handles a lot of the things for you, right? So, for instance, like wiring up like all of the clients and things like that, like that's challenging at times. So, there's a lot of samples online and there's a lot of things in the SDK that are very helpful. So I want to actually show you the code that I actually use to just make a call to Graph. So if I go so this is it right here. Basically, so since I'm using the Graph SDK, all I have to do is just call the me endpoint, the me endpoint, which is basically just getting your context, and then presence, and that's it. So it's really, really easy. And while you were actually talking, I actually did spin up Visual Studio. So give me 1 second to move it over to this window, and I'll just show you kind of the things that you can do inside the Graph API, right? So, and this is the Lifix version, so I'm still working on some of the kinks here. But if I go to find me dot,
I can just see everyone at home and their partners are going to be like staring at the globe now, waiting for these things to go back from red to green. It's going to be all your fault, Isaac.
Yeah, I've been talking to some folks from Microsoft who are already like their wives are already irritated. Because one of the things when I first rolled this out is I didn't give you the ability to select the light. So if you had a bunch of lights, it would change all the lights colors. So one gentleman told me his wife was like, if you do this again, like you're gonna have to go work somewhere else, like in the garage.
She's like unscrewing all the light bulbs around the house.
Exactly. So the Graph API. So once you actually wire up like an authenticated client, like you have access to like a ton of things, right? So for most of the stuff that you want to do, you want to get me. So me is just your user profile. So like I'm not just getting the presence API when I use presence light. I'm actually getting I'm getting my photo, as you saw. There's my photo was there, and also my name, right? So me is in your name, and I can actually just show you what that looks like. Where is one of the things I got to do as well here is I got to clean up a lot of this code. This code is looking pretty rough these days. So what I'm doing here is I call this get batch content. And what this does is it actually makes a batch request using the Graph SDK to get a user, the presence, and then the photo. So what I'm doing here is I'm actually just doing that. And as you can see, it's not a lot of code, right? So it's graph service client.me.request. That gets you a user presence. Graph service.me.presence.request. That gets you the presence API. And if you want to get a photo, it's just a matter of sending across, me.photo.content, and that gets you a byte stream back with the photo in it. So again, the SDK is awesome. You can actually do a lot of this as well without the SDK. Like everything is just REST requests. I think I have a sample of the REST request. So give me 1 second. Might not be in it. No, I'm using the API there. I might not have it in this branch, but there's some code definitely on GitHub that shows you how to do it. So let me hop over here.
What made you pick WPF? Was it because you really had in mind of the tray and the fact that you wanted that thing to be in the bottom right so you can easily see it as an app running on your machine? Obviously, the world seemed to snap to web by default, and so just interested in that approach.
Yeah, so one of the things I like the idea of having I fell in love with the concept of having like the little icon down at the bottom, and that's probably the worst way to build an application. But one of the things that I ran into when I was playing around, so the original goal was to have this run on a Raspberry Pi, not connected to anything. So I just have a Raspberry Pi running, pulling my presence. Unfortunately, some of the things that I'm trying to do, you don't have the ability to do that in application mode. You can only do it in delegated mode. So basically, you can only run it as a user interactively. So I have to go and get a token, right? So I can't really do that easily running in a daemon or some sort of headless item like a Raspberry Pi or some other IoT device. So I was like, okay, well, if I need to be tethered to a machine to actually get the token, I might as well have a user experience behind it. And I really like the idea of just the WPF app because I think that's what people would gravitate towards, especially if it was in the store, which I have a goal of putting into the store at some point. And then I ran into obviously an issue. It's like, okay, well, if it's WPF, it only runs on Windows. So that's when I started to build out this other version, which is like a background service running in the background and a web UI for settings, and they talk to each other. So that's kind of where I've kind of come to. There's probably a million different ways you can do this as well. You can probably do this with Azure Functions or other things. The only thing is that the user actually has to get the token interactively. So yeah, so if you run into a situation where you get prompted for a login, like you can use this anywhere, right? So as long as you can get a token and pass that token somewhere, you can do whatever. And then you just obviously have to figure out like maintaining the state of that token when it expires. But
one interesting thing, and this is good for graph developers in general to hear, is MSIT internally have a conditional access rule on certain products that we use, that we have to be domain joined, or the device needs to be managed. So for instance, my iPhone, to use Teams on it, requires the company portal app to be on there so that I can register the device and it's now Intune managed, and then I can install Teams and use it. And because of that conditional access policy, things like this means that if I downloaded Isaac's app and tried to run it on a laptop that wasn't domain joined, it wouldn't actually work, because the Graph API will actually listen to those conditional access rules and block like that. And so some of the nature of, if Teams is conditional access, this presence is part of that conditional access policy. And so you just have to be aware of those things as you're going through it. As Isaac mentioned, this is only for delegated permissions right now. It isn't for application permissions. I believe there is a user voice already. So if there is scenarios where you'd like to see this as a daemon service, I know I've seen people that would like actually multiple light bulbs on their desk that they can just glance at and see that people are available or not. Because right now, Isaac's polling is just for his presence, but you can actually do it for other users as well with different permission requests.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And it's one of those things where, I've found a way to work around it. But yeah, like being able to see the presence of somebody else is very interesting. And for anybody that's interested, if you don't want to use the Graph SDK for whatever reason, it's very, very easy to wire up a Graph call, right? So I have an access token that I'm passing into my HTTP client, and then that's the endpoint, and that's it, right? I'm cheating a little bit here because I'm actually using the Graph SDK for the presence object, and I'm serializing into it, but I'm not making the HTTP call with the SDK. I'm using the object underlying that are in the SDK because it just makes more sense that way.
There was a question in the chat about, can you set the presence? The answer is no. Right now, it's just a get presence, either for yourself on WhackMe or users/user ID and then presence.
One thing to call out as well is that if you look at the documentation for Microsoft Teams, so it collects not just all of the user configured states, but also the app configured as well. So if you really want to know, if you want people to know, hey, don't bother me, I'm presenting, for instance, like right now, I could have it be any color specifically, right? You're not just controlled by the ones that you can actually set in the tool itself. It'll actually read in and say, okay, well, it looks like Isaac is presenting because he's sharing his screen. Change the color to a particular thing. You can definitely wire that up very, very easily using the Presence API, because the Presence API not only has the availability that you set, but it also has some additional data as pertains to what the actual state of what you are in Teams is.
And so the other thing I noticed in your code is you do have a polling mechanism in there, because you're constantly checking that.
Yep.
So obviously that's a fair bit of load on Graph in terms of the calls. What kind of timing are you checking in your instance the polling on a loop? Yeah.
So I'm only polling for presence every 5 seconds. So so obviously I don't know what the rate limits exactly are. But yeah, what would happen really quickly is if I was polling like every half second, I imagine that at some point Graph would get irritated. I think 5 seconds is enough for my particular use case, because 5 seconds isn't a ton of time between the changing of colors. But if you really want like a high fidelity thing that is actually checking presence like very, very perfectly real time, like you are going to have to take care of those rate limits.
Right.
So that's one thing to call out. And another thing as well is that this is polling, obviously. Hopefully in the future, the Graph team can set up some sort of webhook or something like that, so we don't have to be polling. But right now, I think there's some value there in seeing what our
I think
options
there
are
is
for,
actually
like,
a user
webhooks.
voice, and I can see Vincent posting the user voice links in the chat, but I believe there is a user voice for the webhook as well as the app-only requests,
Yep.
which are the two ones that I have seen from these scenarios being built. And then Harlan had a question as well around any idea when we might be able to get last seen or away since date time. I haven't heard about that one. If you can put it as a user voice request, Harlan, and I'll get the PM that kind of owns those things to kind of give any indication of whether it's on the roadmap or not. And there's Vincent. Thank you, Vincent, for posting the webhook subscription for Teams Presence, which has 23 votes right now. It'll be interesting to see after seeing this whether that goes up. With a little bit of time left, is there anything else you wanted to share, Isaac, in terms of your learnings of using the graph? I had one call out with the throttling. If you're using the SDK and you do thrush it, so you change that down to milliseconds to go check, the SDK will back off with the fact the service will tell you've hit the 429 limits. Okay. So it will wait a certain amount of time and then it will try again for you. Whereas if you just do straight HTTP calls, you'd have to do the back off logic yourself. So that's one benefit of using the SDK with this aspect too.
Yeah, and I think one of the things as well is that I think the reason why I wanted to show both is that to be like hitting the Graph API just like with using a curl or using an HTTP client is very, very easy. When you're wiring up the Graph SDK clients, there is some subtleties in there that you have to pay attention to the docs on. So it's one of those things where I'd like to show both. So it's definitely one of those things. Also, as well, one of the things I didn't talk about really heavily was okay, so you log in to Azure Active Directory, right? And then that gets turned into something else that allows you to make a call, right? So there is some finessing that goes on that takes your access token from Azure AD and then it sends it over to Graph. You need particular permission set up in with your application, right? So you need user.presence.read. That's one of the ones that you need. And there are a couple of them that are marked as admin consent only. So it's one of those things that if you do want this in your own sub, you are going to have to work with internal IT to make sure that you're meeting any governance standards that you have.
Yeah, and that's definitely feedback we would like around this. There is discussions internally that questions admin consent being required for this particular API. So we'd love to have your feedback in the chat window or Twitter or even in user voice if you feel like this is that big of an ask not to require admin consent. It's something that we've put in based on compliance and privacy kind of scenarios that we feel like this is something that needs to be protected by an admin consent approach. Interesting with MSIT, we have an internal process for requesting graph permissions. And Isaac, I don't know how long your experience was, but someone else internally did it. And MSIT turned it around in 24 hours, which under current global climate conditions, MSIT must just feel like they're on fire. I figured that was pretty good that they turned that around that quickly.
Yeah, mine didn't take very long either. I think the hardest part was there's an email interaction, right? And I think the individual that I'm working with wasn't on the same time zone as me, so there was just a gap there. But yeah, I think it took maybe 2 days. Which is really nothing. Which is really nothing when you think about it, right?
Yeah, I guess it just depends how the IT department, they're running Microsoft 365, how familiar they are with this stuff, and being able to send them to the right set of information of this is what this means, and here's some guidance for you as an IT pro, which I know Microsoft Identity have, which makes that a lot easier. So Isaac, we have Beth presenting as well today, so I just want to say thanks so much, mate. I really appreciate you sharing that and getting that on GitHub and getting it in the store will make things super easy for people who don't even want to download code and compile it and run it.
Yeah, so one of the things as well is that you don't have to download the code and compile and run it. So I'll get you a link. You can actually install the WPF application in sideload mode. So you don't need to download code and do any compilation. The only thing that's hard, so to say, with getting Presence Light up and running is you have to create the Azure AD application, right?
Yeah, that's right.
Other than that, everything else, I can make it as easy as possible for folks. But again, you still are going to have to do something in the Azure AD tenant to get that to work. But again, thanks for letting me chat about something that I've been playing around with for a couple of months. And I'm active on Twitter, like Jeremy said. So if anybody has any questions or feedback, just let me know. I'm also taking contributions. So if you are good with WPF, I would love your help because this is actually the first WPF I've ever written in my entire life. So it's been a fun thing to learn. So yeah, again, if you have any questions or comments or anything, just feel free to reach out. And thanks, Jeremy, for having
me. Thanks, Isaac. I really appreciate that.
Hey, Isaac, Jeremy, before we transition the topic, I just wanted to mention 2 things. Hey, everyone, this is Yina. And just on 2 topics. One, webhook support for the Presence API is coming actually really soon. So hopefully by the summer, we will have something to share there. And 2, there was a comment around the permission scopes. We're also working on that to make them available for end users to consent. And so hopefully, again, in a couple of months, we will be able to see changes there so that everyone can get access to the Presence API without requiring the intervention of an administrator.
That's awesome. Thanks, Gina. I wasn't aware of the timeframes of that webhook thing, so that's great. And then on top of that, there were 3 other projects that people have been reaching out and engaging with us on. And so I just wanted to make sure that the others got their light there. Simon Agram, for instance, actually has a blog post that he talks about the different scenarios with Power Automate, which was Microsoft Flow, and using the presence for kind of gated logic on whether someone should get an approval process or not is whether they're available. So in very fast-paced business processes where you have to make decisions quickly, the ability to decide whether it goes to them based on their being actually available or busy is kind of a really cool scenario. So definitely go check that out. And then Matthias Hawkstra is in Identity 6P team, and Sage Lowenhart have also got different implementations, with different coding languages. So it's good to see this much buzz around an API on the graph, and something very useful, especially in the current climate where my toddler is going to be banging on the door, and hopefully I'll be able to educate her that red light means please don't bang on the door because I'm in a community call right now. Okay, so with that, we're going to transition over to the Microsoft Graph Toolkit, which is another really exciting part of what we do from a developer experience aspect with Microsoft Graph. And Beth, if you would like to introduce yourself. Beth works on the team and has been working with various other people that have been on this show before. But Beth's going to talk about the release of 1.2 on Microsoft Graph.
Sure. Hi, everyone. My name is Beth, software engineer on the Graph Toolkit team. I joined the team actually a couple months ago, aiming to help drive some of the developer platform-related work. I've always been very passionate about developer experience, so hopefully this is going to help. So for the people on the call, I just would like to call out that today I'm not going to talk a lot about how to use the Graph Toolkit, but focusing on all the new release elements that we have for V1.2. Firstly, we have a new component that was introduced to the toolkit. Yay! It's called the Teams Channel Picker. So we've been getting a lot of community requests around, I have this workflow that I wanted to pick a channel for a user that this user belongs to certain teams, and these teams have all these channels, and that was the first step that I wanted to do something with the Graph API. So we've taken that in and built this component for you. Here, let me just show the demo real quick. For those who's familiar with the Graph Toolkit, the goal for us is to make it very, very simple for developers to have UI components added to their web environment or Teams or SharePoint, some of the Microsoft platforms that's out there. So the reason for that is we keep hearing developers saying, it's very complicated to write all these plumbing code for me to connect to the graph, to log into the graph, that I have to learn all the authentication and authorization flows. So we wanted to take care of that in the background for you. For this one specifically, a Teams channel picker, all you need to do is go to your front end and add this HTML tag to it. Outside of that, you have to install the package that we provide. So now what you can do is, looking at the teams that this user belongs to, which Megan is the current user that's signed in. Looking at all the channels within these teams that she is part of, and also pick a channel from the beginning. And if you want to change the channel, all you need to do is go back there and then pick something else. We also enabled a lot of keystrokes. So if I start tapping, design, I can go up and down, use tabs to close and open, and then select the channel that I wanted. To bring a little bit information to this as well, the environment that I'm in, mgt-get, is a playground that we built specifically for developers to help explore and tweaking some of the components that you wanted to add to your environment before actually doing it. So we included more samples other than just the basic, Teams channel picker under the Teams channel picker component, where you can say, if I wanted to look at the channel that I selected, I can say get selected channel, then it will list the information of the channel that you selected. And you can also, on the right side, there's a code editor that we also included because we wanted you to be able to tweak the JavaScript, the CSS, and if you want to add your own HTML attributes or adding JavaScript to tweak the properties, you can do it directly on the right side, and then it'll be reflected on the canvas to the left. So that's just a little background for the toolings that I'm using around here. And the other thing that's worth calling out is we're thinking about adding dark mode to our components. We've been exploring this idea for a while, and we decided to start with the component that we're building last. So for dark mode here, if you're in, if your developer has turned on dark mode in the web or in the application of environment of Teams, where I can say is here I've changed all the knobs for or the CSS properties that we customly built in for you. And all you need to do is just give it the theme that you desire for dark mode or other types of themes. Going back to...
So Beth, these can be used like in Teams tabs, or they could be using a standalone web app. You're just purely with Microsoft Graph Toolkit. It's just a package reference that you're putting inside of your web applications.
Correct. So what Jeremy was talking about is that we have a couple out-of-the-box authentication providers included in the package, where you can include something like MGT, MSTAL provider, Teams provider, or SharePoint provider to be able to include, for example, this Teams component into a Teams tab, or like you see in the web environment. Okay. That was the newest component that we have in the family. We've also made so many improvements according to the conversations that we had with our developer community. Sometimes we answer questions on Stack Overflow, or people directly file issues and PRs on our GitHub repo. So these are some of the bugs improvements that people have been asking for. First of all, for MGT Person, it used to be all of these little bubbles for people's profile. If you don't have a profile picture, it used to be all this purple color. So we have people saying, we want the experience that looked like M365, and for Teams and all these person profiles, there are different colors that comes out of Fabric UI, which we are using Fabric UI core to provide that kind of experience for people. So we've taken that feedback in and kind of calculated the color of all these MGT Person component, and then did a hash on the name. So when your bubble is showing up multiple places on the page, it's always going to be the same color. And then we also centered, some of these. We were told that the letters were too big in the bubbles, so we shrink the bubbles according to how Fabric UI has been instructed us. So I'm showing this in the MGT people environment just because I wanted to show like a list of bubbles instead of this one, just to clarify. But this is the MGT Person component. The second one that I wanted to call out is we made a lot of improvements for MGT Person Card. To start with, a lot of people have asked, we wanted the person card sometimes to be a standalone component versus it used to be you have to have a person bubble and you hover over it or you click it, and then there's this drop down that all the data is inherited from the component that we used before. So people were asking, hey, can I just have a standalone component for MGT Person? Since you asked, we've edited the support for it. Now you can use either person query or person ID to supply for this component. And then we're going to make the call to the graph in the background and get all the information for example, Megan in this situation. And then if you expand it, there's the detailed information that we have as well. But you can still use the default version of, hover over and then see all this information. Another thing that we added to this is deep linking into Teams chat. If I don't have it set up right now, but if I have this, if I have a person person card component within a Teams tab environment. When I click the chat bubble, it'll open up the deep link into this person that I wanted to chat with Megan. Right now in the web, if I click it, it'll just target a new browser and trying to tell me to open up Teams. That was the second thing. The third thing is now person card is a little bit smarter than before, which means if it's inherited some data from other components, for example, MGT person, and it doesn't have all the data that we wanted to show these chat bubbles, email, or phone number, it'll actually make a supplemental call to the graph in the background and then retrieve the extra information for you. Third one that I wanted to say, this is interesting because we were just talking about polling and present API, and originally I was scheduled to, talk before Isaac, and I was like, I don't want to steal his thunder. So if we're polling, we've added support in all of our component where you can actually actively check against, your application or the graph call, the Graph API to see some of the status of whatever scenario that you have. I think we started thinking about this because people were asking us, hey, I want to display a list of chats that I have within a Teams environment. But when it shows it, I have to constantly refreshing to get the new chats into these channels. So let me show you how this look like. So like I said, the toolkit is aimed at making it very easy for developers to add just a couple lines of code into their web environment or whatever environment that you like that we support for auth providers. And then, like you see, this is a very simple HTML default kind of. There's a head, there's a body, and then in the head that I included the script tag where you load the actual Microsoft Graph Toolkit. And then I'm using a MSOL provider to connect to the graph. All I'm doing here is adding a login button, and then I'm having a call to the graph where I provide the resource, identify the version, setting the scopes, and then here is the part that we added to 1.2 release, where you can add a polling rate for the specific resource that you're looking at. So if I run a server that serves this page, and then open up my browser. So I open up an incognito window ahead of time where I signed in as one of our tenant users. Like as excited before, you kind of need to go grab AD client ID to be able to enable some of these scenarios. But I'm not going to focus on that right now. So like I said in the code, all I did was I'm using a provider to show a login button, and then I'm doing something else here, and I'm showing the person's availability in this block. So the right side of the window here, I'm actually logged in as Megan. When I change my status to available, here it's going to pull it every 3 seconds and then change it to available. Or if I want to be right back, then Megan's status on the left side is going to change too.
And so the MGT template, Beth, the MGT component is really just the ability that the mgt-get is allowing you just to call any resource on the graph and have your own rendering template. And in this case, you're just grabbing the availability property that gets returned by the me/presence call. But that could be anything on the graph, and then you render whatever. Yeah,
so I think when we first started, we have about 6 or 7 components built in. And then we have questions, again, from the community saying, like, hey, what if I wanted to just make a graph call? Can you help me do that? Versus using, all your included version of either get or either login or person card or person or people. So we decided to include mgt-get, which is very, very flexible for developers to just supply the very central portion for a Graph API to be able to use the data that's passed into this HTML element. Where I'm going to talk about template here in a minute, how to use it and the syntax of it, but that's the gist of mgt-get.
That's awesome, thank you.
Cool. Coming back to this one, the last demo that I have is around templating. Let me just click this from here. We've made a lot of improvements around templating. For example, it used to be you have to include double handlebars to be able to use the data that's retrieved from the graph. People using different frameworks has talked to us and said, sometimes I'm used to the triple handlebar syntax, so we made it exclusive. So you can now both use double handlebars or triple handlebars to handle your data for HTML attributes. That was one thing. We also said, what if I forgot about handlebars altogether? Then now I can not use handlebars at all. Make it easier for people to utilize expressions in attributes such as data if or data for, where you just, there's no handlebar needed anymore. The last thing was right here. We've introduced a new syntax called data props, where we allow developers to bind both events like this. You can do a ampersand, @ sign. I don't know what this is called. English is not my first language, it's hard. Do like @click, and then you add a bind event to this prop. Or you can also bind properties such as inner HTML from the data that you retrieved from the graph. So this sample shows if I use a mgt-get, which allows me to call the graph, and then I'm using that data to get all the messages and showing for the specific channel that I picked from the component of Teams channel picker. Let me show you above here. So if I say I wanted to pick a channel, the design channel, which has a lot of conversation, now because I added the mgt-get template, or template nested in the mgt-get, which gets all the messages listed in this channel, and you can see, we're showing the person component here, what this person has said, coming down, and you can also reply right in the context of where this conversation happens, and just say like, hey, I wanted to respond to someone and say like, have you received the vendor contract? I'm going to say I have and reply, and this is going to show up in your Teams.
So how does that mgt-get know that it's looking for the messages call? Is that just because of the ID of that particular component?
No, sorry, I was just getting to it.
Oh, okay,
so
sorry.
we've also, no, you're fine. We've also included some JavaScript in this context just to not pollute, give you a clearer view of what we're doing here. So yeah, so here's the call that's being made to the graph. We're getting channels, channel IDs, and delta, and based on this ID, we're going to show, when we click the message. Oh, so I guess this part only shows, when the channel changes up here, what we're going to do down below. And then we're also showing the click bind when you click on a certain message and this little input bubble shows up, where you can see how the message click is binded using the data props event binding in this templating syntax. So that was a lot around templating, and I know it's kind of a second level because we've already talked about templating before, and I didn't include all the information about how we did templating. But I'm sure, Jeremy, you've done a lot of these community calls, and we have a lot of recordings out there for other members of the team that's already talked about Graph Toolkit.
Yeah,
so
we can definitely make sure the links are there for those previous ones where we've covered templating. I think those updates are awesome, that we can do those additional things like that. That's great.
Cool. Last thing that I wanted to share around this, I know we're almost about time. We did a lot of V2 preparation work. So like I said, all those demos was just a call out for many things that we've done for 1.2. We're preparing for a release for 2.0. If you want to see all the other things that we've done to our components or to the project, you can see it on our GitHub repo under release notes. We've added a lot of lifecycle events for our product in order to prepare for separation of packages between the V1 and beta, because a lot of users, again, was telling us, what if I only wanted to use production-ready versions of Graph, and can you separate those packages out for us? So that was the plan for us. Last thing is we're releasing a blog post series that's going to come alive next Monday. So this link is not live yet, but I just want to point out, if you wanted to follow our blog post series and learn more about Microsoft Graph Toolkit from the beginning, we're trying to make this very easy to follow. We have a lot of demos and hands-on labs prepared for you. This is going to run for a month or two, so keep an eye out.
Yeah, I'm excited for that. We had such great success with the 30 Days of Graph series that Brian Jackett kind of led, with a bunch of MVPs that contributed and internal devs and PMs. And Beth, I really appreciate you taking the challenge of doing the same thing with the Microsoft Graph Toolkit, because we see a lot of value in like a series of posts that walk you through gently building those things. So thank you for taking that on. And yeah, as you say, like next post is going to go out next Monday. So keep an eye on the Microsoft Graph blog. You can just grab that from the graph.microsoft.com website. And again, thanks so much for doing that, Beth. I really appreciate that.
Yeah, no problem. I turned off my giraffe camera because I didn't want to be distracting.
Definitely not the smiling giraffe overlay was kind of a bit weird. And then just as a quick reminder, we do have regular Cadence podcasts that I host with Paul Schaeflein as an external MVP. We just did one. We had Vincent Beret on a community call last month. But we just had him on the podcast talking about webhooks and Delta queries and a bunch of other goodness around the graph, and talking about like kind of the experience with Microsoft Graph. So if you haven't checked out the podcast, there's another way you can keep up to date with what's going on. There are a heap of calls we do across Microsoft 365 on the various different technology and development things. If you're not tapped into those, I'd highly recommend looking at the aka.ms M365 dev calls link. And then just as a big thank you again to Isaac and for Beth for presenting that tech. I love the simplicity of what we've been doing with this stuff. And the fact that Isaac's sharing the GitHub repo, and with MGT, it's so simple. That was a very, very straightforward HTML page that makes it great and easy to go build and connect against the graph. And Beth, thank you so much for being able to like weave in the polling and the presence API into the MGT demo. I'm sure that was really neat that you could do that. So thank you again. This and all the previous month's community call recordings are available on aka.ms/M365dev YouTube. The Twitter handle has changed. It was Office Dev. It is now Microsoft 365 Dev. So if you're not following on Twitter, I'd highly recommend that. That kind of covers announcements across the whole M365 Dev platform. And then in addition to that, next month's call, as usual, is the first Tuesday of the month, which is May 5th. At 8 a.m. PST, so same time, just in a few weeks' time. If you are interested in presenting, we'd love to hear from you. Again, it was great with Isaac and Beth presenting today. Isaac, being inside Microsoft, not really part of our direct team, and the fact that he volunteered to do this is great. We'd love to get more community contributions on here in the calls as well. So if you have got a story to share, you have been playing with some of the stuff on the graph, please reach out to myself on Twitter or via email, just jthake on Twitter or jthake@microsoft.com. via email, and we can get you scheduled up on these calls. So we're at time. Thank you again for joining, and appreciate the conversations going on in the chat. Thank you to Daryl and Vincent and Nina for contributing as I'm running through this presentation with Beth and Isaac. And we'll see you next month.
Thanks, Jeremy.